Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're diving headfirst into a pretty shadowy and kind of fascinating corner of the Cold War. It's about marriages, but not just any marriages. We're talking about American citizens tying the knot with Soviet citizens. I mean, it sounds like something straight out of like a really intense spy movie, right? But this was real life, folks, and it gets surprisingly complex. And to really unpack this, we've managed to get our hands on some really, really interesting primary source material, declassified documents straight from the National Archives.
Yeah, you got it. We're primarily looking at a bunch of memos and correspondence, mostly from June and July 1964. And the really interesting thing is they're coming from inside the CIA and the State Department. These aren't just some random historical tidbits. They really give us like a first-hand look at how the U.S. government was dealing with, the very human side of this huge global rivalry.
Right, right. So our mission, if you will, in this deep dive is to kind of figure out, well, a few things. First, just how complicated were these marriages? What specific questions and worries did they spark within these agencies? And finally, and maybe most importantly, what can these documents tell you, the listener, about this strange mix of love and, well, the Cold War?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's jump right in. We've got this memo from June 1964. There's this guy, Frank Freiberg, from COS Helsinki, that's chief of station for the CIA in Helsinki, just so everyone's clear. And he's giving us all sorts of little details. What really caught your eye in his notes?
Well, what's really interesting is just how detailed he gets. I mean, he's talked about how long it takes to get from downtown Helsinki to the airport, 25 minutes by car, a bit longer if you take a taxi. Then he mentions how the Soviet consulate in Helsinki probably closed early on Saturdays back in like 1959, and that the U.S. consulate only kept passenger lists for like 6 months. He even names this U.S. consular official, a CIA officer named Mr. Robert Fulton, who was there at the time. It's like these little bits of information seem pretty normal on the surface, but it really shows how careful they were with intelligence during the Cold War. Even something like travel times and record keeping could be important if they were trying to track people's movements and contacts across the Iron Curtain.
It does seem, kind of unimportant at first glance, right? But they're obviously trying to put together some kind of puzzle. Why all this focus on Helsinki, do you think?
Well, you got to remember that Helsinki was a really important point of contact during the Cold War. It was a place where the East and West could actually meet without too much trouble compared to other places. So, the fact that the Soviet consulate was so close, the travel times to the airport, all these little things could become super important if you're trying to figure out travel patterns, maybe secret meetings, or even just when someone arrived or left. And the fact that they even kept passenger lists, even if it was just for a short time, shows how interested they were in who was moving between these two totally different worlds.
That's really interesting. Okay, so then we move on to this discussion with Mr. Slauson in July 1964, and it seems like this conversation is much more focused on the old Oswalds themselves. What were the big questions that came up in this discussion?
The main thing they were trying to figure out was whether or not Lee Harvey and Marina Oswald leaving the Soviet Union was, unusual or suspicious in any way. Mr. Slauson said he didn't think there was any real disagreement or inconsistency between what the CIA and the State Department knew. And he basically boiled it all down to three main questions.
Okay, so what were these three big questions they were trying to answer?
The first one was all about whether the Soviets would normally let their citizens move to, well, the Soviet Union. I mean, it sounds kind of obvious, but they meant in cases where the person's spouse was a foreigner. Like, would they let a Soviet citizen emigrate to the Soviet Union to be with their American husband, for example? The State Department seemed to think, yeah, probably. They mentioned all these visa applications, mostly from people sponsoring their family members to come over, often from minority groups. But it's important to note, they didn't say there was a specific law that said yes to this kind of thing. They just said they hadn't seen a law that said no. So it wasn't a definite yes, more like a, well, we don't see why not.
Okay, I see. A subtle but important difference. So what was the second question they were trying to figure out?
The second one was whether Soviet citizens were allowed to actually leave the Soviet Union with their foreign spouses, like at the same time. And here, the State Department's answer seemed a bit different. They didn't exactly say it never happened, but they did point to some evidence that suggested it wasn't the usual thing. And that's a key difference, right? Leaving together because that raises questions about whether there were extra hurdles or if couples like that got more scrutiny.
Right. Leaving together at the same time definitely seems to be a big point of contention here. It does make you think there might have been some roadblocks or a more difficult process for those couples. Okay, so what was the third big question they were wrestling with?
The third question was about how long it took for Soviet citizens to get exit visas if they wanted to do this, the time between applying and actually getting approval. And Mr. Slauson pointed out a pretty big difference here. The State Department seemed to think it didn't take that long. But the information from an earlier memo in April and a letter for this, Mr. Meeker suggested it could take a lot longer. So that difference in how long they thought it took definitely raised some eyebrows.
And did Mr. Slauson have any thoughts on why there might be this difference and how long they thought it took for visas to be approved?
Yeah, he actually made a pretty interesting point. He said that a lot of the cases the State Department was talking about were foreign students, exchange teachers, and people like that, people who were only in the Soviet Union for a short time. But then a bunch of the other cases, including Oswald's, were people who had defected and then married a Soviet citizen before wanting to come back home. So it seems like the Soviet authorities were probably looking at each case differently and being a lot stricter with people who had defected. Basically, if you were a defector who then married a Soviet and wanted to leave with her, it probably took a lot longer and involved a lot more scrutiny than if you were just a foreign student finishing your studies and going home with your spouse.
That makes a lot of sense. The specific circumstances of the person's relationship with the Soviet government seem really important. The memo also mentions that Mr. Slauson was going to write a response to the Warren Commission, summarizing all these points and including a statistical breakdown of the cases. It sounds like they were really trying to get a clear picture for the official investigation.
Absolutely. And they even mentioned Volume 25 of the transcript, which is part of the huge Warren Commission investigation, specifically Marina Oswald's second interview. This shows how directly connected all of this was to the investigation into the assassination. Plus, Mr. Slauson said he'd share his report on Soviet intelligence with the CIA to make sure everything was accurate, which shows how much collaboration and information sharing was going on between different agencies on this sensitive topic.
Right, and that brings us to the analysis of those 26 cases they keep mentioning. This data seems to be the basis for a lot of their conclusions about how normal or not these situations were. What did they find out about Soviet wives leaving with their foreign husbands?
This analysis of 26 specific cases, and 10 of those involved Americans, is really interesting. The big takeaway, and I think this is what really raised red flags about the Oswald, is that in only 3 of those 26 cases did the Soviet wife actually leave with her husband. Now, later documents mentioned 4 cases, so there might be some small details or new info that came up. But the main point is still clear. It was super rare to leave together. I mean, only 3 or 4 out of 26 cases, that's a really small number. And that makes the Oswald situation, if they did indeed leave together, stand out. And you can bet that U.S. intelligence would have been looking into that very closely.
Wow, only 3, maybe 4 out of 26? That really drives home the point that it wasn't the standard thing at all. So what were the situations like in those few cases where the wife did leave with her husband? What made those different?
Okay, so one case was this Italian guy, a member of the Communist Party there. He managed to do his wife out with him by working through diplomatic channels in the Italian embassy. Then there were 2 American guys who met their wives while visiting the USSR, went back to marry them, and then were able to bring them back to the States. We don't have details on that possible 4th case, unfortunately. And there's one more, a Swedish student, who married a Soviet student and seems to have brought her out of the country with him.
So in most of these cases, we're talking 14 out of the 26. The husband left the Soviet Union by himself without his wife. And there's even one case where the wife left first because her husband had been jailed for breaking travel rules a couple of months earlier. That really shows how difficult and, well, how often these couples were separated, right?
Exactly. And in 7 of those 26 cases, they just didn't know when each spouse left based on the information they had. So this all points to Marina Oswald leading with Lee Harvey Oswald, if that's what happened, being really unusual. It makes sense that intelligence agencies would be suspicious.
Right, right. Now, this takes us to the questions the State Department had after reading an earlier CIA memo. They were basically asking, is it even legal for a Russian woman married to an American to go back to America with him? Is that normal under Soviet law? And how did the Oswalds do it so quickly? Was Marina's return strange in any way? How did the CIA answer these questions based on their look at those 26 cases?
Well, the CIA's response directly addressed those questions of legality and, whether it was normal, By referring back to their analysis of those 26 cases, like we've been talking about, they really emphasized how rare it was for the Soviet wife to leave at the same time as her husband. That data was their main argument, suggesting that what the Oswalds did was unusual and therefore needed a closer look.
Now, the documents also mention some apparent disagreements between the CIA and the State Department in their answers. It sounds like there might have been some bureaucratic back and forth or different interpretations of the situation. What were the main points they disagreed on?
It seems like the main disagreement was about how to understand the information they had and what conclusions to draw from it. The CIA, based on their close look at those 26 cases, really focused on how uncommon it was for couples to leave together, suggesting the Oswald's case was strange. But the State Department, as we mentioned earlier, talked about a larger number of visa applications from Soviet citizens who wanted to join their foreign spouses. However, those applications didn't necessarily mean people actually left, especially together, and they weren't all about marriages with Americans. So it seems like they were looking at different sets of data and maybe even asking different questions, which led to these seemingly conflicting views. It's a good reminder that even within the government, different agencies can see things differently depending on what information they're focusing on.
That's a really good point. They even mentioned a meeting on July 9th, 1964, specifically to talk about these disagreements between the CIA and state. What was the outcome of that meeting? What did they decide to do?
The main thing that came out of that meeting was an agreement that the CIA would give the State Department a detailed breakdown of the statistics for those 26 cases. Basically, they wanted to be more transparent about how they reached their conclusions about the whole legality and, more importantly, the typicality of Soviet citizens leaving with their foreign spouses. They wanted to show the specific data points that supported their argument.
Okay, and if we look closer at that important paragraph 7 from the April 6th memo, which was based on those 26 cases, we see again how much they stressed how uncommon it was for couples to leave together only 3, maybe 4 times. Then they repeat the specifics of those few exceptions: the Italian communist, the 2 Americans who went back to marry, and the Swedish student.
That's right. And then the memo also emphasizes that in most of these cases, 14 out of the 26, the foreign spouse left on their own. And in one case, remember, the wife left before her husband because he'd gotten in trouble with the law. And in the other 7 cases, they just couldn't figure out who left first from the records. This statistical picture was really important for the CIA to show that the Oswalds leaving together was unusual.
Right. And then the memo talks about how long it usually took to get these exit visas, specifically mentioning a letter from Mr. Meeker. What did that letter say about the timeline?
Well, the interesting thing is that Mr. Meeker's letter, which was all about how long it took Soviet wives of Americans to get exit visas, actually backed up the CIA's findings from those 26 cases. In most of the 25 cases where they could figure out or estimate the time frame, it took a long time, from about 5 to 12 months and sometimes even longer.
So while the State Department was saying it was technically possible for Soviet spouses to emigrate, the CIA's data, supported by Mr. Meeker's info about actual processing times, showed that long delays were normal and leaving quickly together was really unusual. That definitely wasn't a quick and easy process. It was more like a long and complicated bureaucratic maze.
Absolutely. The memo even points out specific cases where there were big delays in getting those exit visas, like 5 months in one, 6 months in another, and even 9 months in a third. And in several other cases where they had to guesstimate the timeline based on the info they had, it still looked like it took several months, like 4 to 5 months in one, 6 to 7 in another, about 9 months in a third, and 11 to 12 months in yet another. And get this, in 3 more cases, it took at least 7, 11, and 12 months. The memo even acknowledges that the difference between their statistics and the State Department's probably came down to how they were analyzing the information and what data they were looking at.
Fascinating. Now, beyond all the numbers and the back and forth between agencies, these documents all have some really interesting examples of individual cases, these little glimpses into what it was actually like for the people involved. It really brings the human element back into focus, doesn't it?
It really does. These little snippets show us just how different and difficult the experiences were for American men who married Soviet women during this time. For example, there's Adele Zaslavsky, whose husband, Harold Berman, apparently had to really fight to get her out of the USSR. Then there's Leonard Kirsch. His wife came to the U.S. much later than him, and Joseph Fondum's wife said her family and the KGB were making it hard for her to leave. In Edgar Lerman's case, his wife faced problems from the university she worked at, seemingly because she was married to a foreigner.
These aren't just statistics in a government memo. These are real people whose lives were deeply affected by the Cold War. The fact that it was so hard to get wives out of the Soviet Union, the pressure from the Soviet authorities, the long delays, it all shows that even if Soviet policy technically allowed these marriages, the reality could be really tough and unpredictable. And we see mentions of other people too: Gunnar Lordenstam, John Sandor, Alan David Packler, and lots more, each with their own story about navigating these relationships across international borders.
Exactly. These individual stories remind us that while the statistics give us a general idea of what was going on, they don't tell the whole story. Each couple faced unique challenges and obstacles.
Right. Finally, we have a little excerpt from an FBI report in July 1964 about Philip Robert Nielsen and his marriage to Tamara Stepanovna Kungurtseva. This adds a whole other dimension to our deep dive, highlighting the security worries and the level of scrutiny these marriages faced, especially from an intelligence perspective.
Yeah, this FBI report is short, but it speaks volumes. It really shows the fear and suspicion around these marriages during the Cold War. In Nielsen's case, a government agent doing a routine security check said back in April 1962 that Philip's wife, Tamara, might be connected to Soviet intelligence. The report even says the agent thought Soviet intelligence might be using her. Then the FBI interviewed Tamara in May 1963. She told him about her marriage to Philip in Moscow and admitted he had ties to the U.S. The report also mentions her brother, Boris Kun Gurtsev, who was a translator in Moscow. And then Tamara herself became a Soviet citizen in February 1964. This whole thing really underscores the paranoia of the Cold War and how much suspicion there was around marriages between people from different sides of the Iron Curtain.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into these Cold War documents, we're left with a lot of tension and unanswered questions. We see the CIA and the State Department trying to figure out what to make of these marriages between Americans and Soviets, which were, pretty uncommon at the time. And they clearly have different opinions on how easy and normal it was for Soviet citizens to leave the USSR with their American spouses. The detailed data really shows us that those long, uncertain waits for exit visas were far more common than quick departures together.
You got it. These records give us a really interesting and sometimes kind of creepy look into how much the intelligence community was scrutinizing what seemed like personal relationships. And all this is happening against the backdrop of the Cold War and all the anxieties that came with it. The Oswald's case in particular seems to have really amplified these concerns, leading to a super thorough re-examination of past cases. They were trying to figure out what was considered normal and what was potentially suspicious. And that's a tricky line to draw, right?
Absolutely. And as we end our exploration of these fascinating documents, we want to leave you, the listener, with a thought-provoking question. What does all of this tell us about the complex ways that individual lives can get caught up in these huge geopolitical tensions? How did government agencies, with their focus on national security, try to make sense of these deeply personal choices that people were making? And what other questions does this spark for you about all the untold individual stories that are probably hidden within the official accounts of the Cold War? It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about countries and ideologies clashing, it's also about the human experiences of the people who lived through those times.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.